Welcome to Brain Snacks, bite-sized learning moments from Live and Work More Human. To learn more, check out the full conversation at the link in the show notes or visit liveandworkmorehuman.com. It's now, enjoy.
Before we dive into the full episode, here's a quick message from our podcast partners. What if every organization could deeply understand and optimize the potential of its greatest asset, its people?
Humanico blends cutting-edge insight with powerful organisational intelligence to give leaders a single, clear map of their people and how they thrive.
Cut through the noise of disconnected tools and surveys. Humanico brings it all together into one dynamic, intuitive platform, empowering better decisions, wiser strategies, and stronger teams, so humans and organisations flourish.
Humanico, putting people first at every level. To learn more, visit humanico.co/live and work more human. That's humanico.co/live and work more human.
Children, even as little as 4 or 5 years old, learn to understand that even though their parents told them always be honest, actually that's not going to work in life, right? They have to learn to master the art of performative white lies and to pretend that they like the cake when they didn't, and to pretend that they like their Christmas present when they didn't, or to pretend that they believe in Santa Claus when in fact they didn't, because otherwise they're going to spoil things for everybody else, right? So pro-social lying is really important already when we are children. And of course, there has been in recent years a lot of talk about so-called cultures of radical candor and radical transparency, like Bridgewater and Ray Dalio, and to some degree, a milder version of that is Amazon. These are horrible environments to work in. And even Ray Dalio himself says, well, if somebody just had a child and returned to the office and is showing you a picture of their baby, you're not going to say that's a really ugly baby, right? So there's always like a case for censoring what you really, really think. And that the case generally has to do with empathy being more important and with actually, persuasively or convincingly making an effort to not hurt other people's feelings. Then there is a more metaphysical and philosophical element of that. Is like, can you truly be honest with others if you're not honest with yourself, right? And this is really, really important to actually flesh out or expand because, as you know, I've researched incompetent leadership for a long time, and the typical kind of archetype of the incompetent man who becomes a leader actually signals the prevalence of self-deception in leadership and in the corporate world, in organizational life, right? If you bullshit yourself about thinking, into thinking that you're amazing when you're not, that you're a great, person, leader, salesman, etc., you don't even have to bullshit other people. You can be honest with others. Because it's like the best salesman or salesperson doesn't need to lie to their customers because they have lied to themselves about thinking like, this is an amazing product, an amazing tool, etc. So that happens as well. And what's interesting here is there's a lot of nuance because on the one hand, the world would be better off if we all had self-awareness and we all knew our limitations and but actually much of the corporate world is sadly optimized to reward people who have deceived themselves. If you go to a job interview thinking that you're amazing when you're not, you're going to beat the candidates that demonstrate some self-doubt. If you're giving a presentation to a client and you think you're incredible when you're not, and of course that happens more often if you're a man than if you're a woman. But, we should be careful, like preaching honesty when the world actually and society at large is rewarding dishonesty even with ourselves. As I said before, it's not so easy to truly understand who you really are or whether you're being honest. So I think I take an interpersonal framework to assess kind of a genuineness and sincerity and honesty, which is like, it's much more helpful, even though it sounds a little bit counterintuitive. But if other people see you as trustworthy, that means you're behaving in such a way that there is sufficient closeness between your words and your actions, and there is sufficient reliability and predictability in your behavior. And ultimately, being a great boss is having created a reputation in your team whereby they feel safe, They're not afraid
Yeah.
that tomorrow they don't know who they're going to find, and that actually doesn't come as a consequence of always being honest with them. It comes as a consequence of caring about them and curating a consistent professional self that may or
Yeah.
not resemble the real you.
Thomas, to my mind, what you've just said also links directly to another trap that you mentioned in the book, which is don't worry about what others think of you. And to sort of rewind for a second here, we have a concept that we speak about at Human Leaders a lot, which we call the intention impact gap. And as you've mentioned, it's kind of this idea, it's the space between how we think we're showing up and the actual impact that others, or we're having on others rather. And so can you tell us a little bit more around this trap around actually caring about what others think and how these maybe interrelate?
Yeah. And so I tell a little story, little anecdote in the book, which is a true story. Somebody, who works for me in my team, by the way, that still not aware of this. So they're going to find out when they read the book that,
When the book comes out.
not identified, but lovely guy, high performing, high potential leader, genuinely curious and interested in improving his leadership, and just a great guy, very, very liked by everybody else, but unfortunately somewhat corrupted or contaminated by mainstream self-help thinking, especially in the US, around leadership. And so one day he came to my office wearing this t-shirt that said, "Just be you, they will adjust." And he was proudly wearing this t-shirt, hoping, to talk about not just, his performance at work, but this.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't help myself, I could not be myself. And I said, "Can we talk about your t-shirt for a minute? Because you realize this is like possibly the most narcissistic item of clothing anybody could ever wear. Like if we all do this, we would be living in a world of like a bunch
Chaos.
of self-centered, egomaniac, entitled
Yeah.
narcissists. Like, and if you are the only person able to wear that T-shirt because the world needs to adjust to you, which, by the way, I know isn't true because that's not how he thinks, but it had never occurred to him that there was this strong narcissistic, selfish connotation to this, right? Of course, at the other extreme, sometimes when I talk about this or the research in places like Korea or Japan or even Sweden and Finland, people say, "But we hear you and understand you, but we're already so oppressed." In Sweden, you have sayings such as "the nail that sticks out needs to be hammered back in," and people are always so polite and to some degree conformist, but so sensitive to the cultural etiquette that they would never tell you that they disagree with you. And there is a downside to that, of course, which is passive aggressiveness and conflict avoidance. I always say conflict avoidant people generate a lot of conflict in the long run, right?
Yep.
But I think both extremes are problematic. And what I'm trying to do in a way is kind of dial down the narcissism and the self-centeredness that has, kind of corrupted or contaminated mainstream thinking coming from West Coast US sort of like self-help to all the way to Australia. Of course, I think Australia in some ways has the strength of both British and American cultures. You're capable of not taking yourself too seriously, and you can be self-deprecating, and you understand sarcasm and irony, but you also have a kind of healthy and positive American sense of can-do optimism, right? But sometimes you also have the worst of both worlds, right? And it's like,
Yeah.
not positive enough and not negative enough. But so, this mantra fundamentally says, look, I mean, it will be impossible for you to follow this rule that don't worry about what people think of you unless you're autistic or on the spectrum or a feral child, So in a way, we should disregard it altogether or at the outset because you can follow it. But even if you try to follow it, be careful, because we know from 360-degree surveys that the best leaders are those who are aware of the reputation. So they are, what does it mean to be self-aware? To be self-aware actually means to be other-aware, to know how other people see you. And it's only when you can incorporate other people's views on you into your self-concept that you can actually grow and hope to change them. Even people who were not self-aware in the traditional introspective sense of the word, like Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump, they're very good at understanding how they impact others. Now, they don't always care about that, or they don't always care about changing their behaviors in the direction that some people might want, but they're masters at understanding. Even if you think about that scene, right, where he's shot last year and his first reaction is to stand up and the fist goes up and say, fight, fight, fight. I mean, who on earth would think of doing that in that situation? And again, it's that you don't have to like him to appreciate that he's constantly on stage. He's constantly on stage. So actually, the point that I make is that people, the leaders who seem authentic to us, and I'm talking about not the ones that we like from an ideological standpoint, but the ones that actually are outside our values and our ideological kind of echo chamber or cosmos or realm, we see them as authentic because they behave like method actors. They're constantly in character to the point, and I think in that sense, Trump is not very different from Obama. I'm sure both are very different from their public personas when they get home. We have to ask maybe Michelle and Melania to tell us that. But at the same time, I'm sure they're very difficult. It's very hard to catch them off guard because they're performing all the time. So if you think about that, that's like the opposite of saying, "Oh, don't worry about what people think of you." They may have stopped worrying because it's so natural to them that they became their professional self.
Right.
And I think sometimes we equate this with being a politician. There is often a thin line between very acute or sophisticated political skills and being a politician, which has a bad reputation. But actually, you are going to be more successful in your career as a leader and as an organizational citizen or employee if you're closer to that than if you just say anything that crosses your mind to anybody and you don't give a shit about what people think of you, for sure, right? I would say, if Elon Musk is your role model, or Steve Jobs, or Donald Trump, or whoever that is, well, good luck going through the first stage of your interviews if you're hoping to be employed by somebody. There's a reason why a lot of these people had to work for themselves and weren't able to sustain a job when they had a boss.
We hope you enjoyed this brain snack from Live and Work More Human. Learn more at www.liveandworkmorehuman.com. See you next time.